Hey folks, let's talk about the contrast slider in Darktable's color balance RGB module. For images where the majority of tones are in the shadows and only a few tones are very bright, you might notice the contrast slider isn't behaving as you'd like. For example, let's take this self-portrait I took of myself with the Tamron 90mm f2.8 macro lens. By the way, it took a lot of tries to get this right, and I do recommend experimenting with self-portraits because it can really refine your posing skills. Anyway, I purposefully kept the contrast low here, but now let's say I want to increase it. Of course, there are many ways of increasing the contrast in Darktable, but let's say you wanted to use the contrast slider in the color balance RGB module. You'll notice that if I start to increase the contrast, it rapidly pushes the highlights too far. That's because the pivot point or fulcrum at which the contrast slider increases contrast is too low on the histogram. We'd like to increase that so less of the highlights are pushed and more of the shadows are pushed. To do this, go to the Masks tab. Now, there's a slider called Contrast Gray Fulcrum. Simply increase it to increase the level of that fulcrum. You may have to adjust it to taste, but the higher it is, the more the contrast slider will bias towards darkening the shadows. Now, when I go back to the contrast slider and increase it, you'll notice that the highlights are increased relatively little and it looks much better. That's it. I hope this tip helps you use the contrast slider in the color balance RGB module, but if it didn't, consider doing something else.